I want to begin by presenting you with an argument. We've moved from masonry understood to be covered, where architecture is seamless and therefore seamly, to architecture where exposing the joints in parallel with bare stone has become just about everything. So when I think of pointing, I think of it as the final iteration of a cultural process, but one that's exposed us to the loss of fabric rather than its care. So we've settled into a sort of curated neglect rather than a reflection of the aspirations of two separate but interlinked groups of people. Those who commissioned work, living in a world where an audience is never absent, and whose lives are tightly circumscribed by advancement and preferment, and those who undertook it, whose silent knowledge resides within the craft of building, innately appreciating what William Adam called rough work, meaning a wall well built, but understood to be coated. In this paper, I argue that there's a relationship between the presentation of architecture and the presentation of self. These two factors combined impact the functionality of the building process. Central to this argument is completely covering rubble masonry. Without protection, I argue, stone decay and water penetration are the inevitable long-term outcomes and present those from the past as lacking in the prerequisites of taste and politeness within the context of the long 18th century. The problem's twofold. Conservation has come to mean pointing, and the process has accrued values that are unsustainable now and in a climate change future. And within the canon of pointing, the process is one-dimensional, a single universal style throughout the country, what my pal Gerard Lynch calls the heritage joint, where the mortar is recessed and beaten with a churn brush to expose the aggregates. Therefore, the aim of this talk is to examine the cultural and physical factors in the history and development of traditional external lime coats and highlight how impactful archaeology could be in promoting the heritage science that can help retain the asset. In this talk, I'll illustrate that the process is stalled because there's a dissonance between the evidence and conservation strategies. I raise two questions. What is evidence, and how did we arrive at a point where it's inconsequential? Disappointingly, I have all the imagination of a field bowl. I'm only interested in the facts and how the data stacks up. And I guess this is at the core of my talk to you today. So I stand before you as an academic tradesman, which for all our lack of safety, our undisciplined approach, our filth, our mess, our drunkenness, and cheers, by the way, we still managed to produce the mason architects of the past, men like Palladio, John Milne, William Adam, and the fabulous James Smith, for example. Men who understood the relationship between the presentation of self through the medium of architecture and the function of the materials and the practice combined. Their understanding of these factors was verifiable by experience and close observation, which is what I am asking of you, but in combination with statistical analysis and actualistic science. Polymath Mary Somerville was a chemist, astronomer, and core figure in the Scottish Enlightenment. She's been described as certainly the most extraordinary woman in Europe, a mathematician of the very first rank. Her book, The Mechanism of the Heavens, was the set text for undergraduates at Cambridge, and her work on the connection of the physical sciences was only surpassed by Darwin's Origin of Species, and her efforts translating algebra into common language remains a hallmark of mathematical dissection. Florence Nightingale is best remembered for her pioneering nursing work in the Crimean War, and she was able to achieve this with her understanding of training, sanitary care, and crucially, statistics. With the use of the data visualization, the polar area diagram, she was able to demonstrate that severe trauma did not inevitably lead to death, and the concept of professional nursing was the lasting outcome. Both women used empirical observations to develop methodologies that in turn tested a hypothesis. They processed data and the results confirmed or rejected the hypothesis. Only then could a conclusion be established. Once the results were scrutinized by a wider community, change was initiated. Systematic analysis is not a force adopted by 19th-century architectural historians who were influenced by art, religion, politics, and the combined notional ideas of truth, morality, and honesty. And this is best appreciated in Ruskin's The Seven Lamps of Architecture. We should be clear, it's the opinion of a wealthy, male, intellectual elite rather than an evidence-based analysis. Britain in the 19th century was class-ridden, church-bound, and the opinions of that elite have accrued the halo factor, which is a really difficult force to resist. How could the truth possibly be wrong? Who could despise honesty? How is saving something somehow inappropriate? Ruskin's difficulty in reconciling his own religiosity with science is enduring. The language of Ruskin in the SPAB plays a part in restraining the heritage community from analysis because it's an attractive outsourcing of the critical acumen of a comfortable and frankly lazy audience. In The Stones of Venice, Ruskin uses the term exquisite 24 times, while in The Lamps, precious is similarly overworked. The language of heritage directed at a particular social and economic group who are articulate and know how to generate support. So, for example, this darling little jewel of a building must be saved for the nation will turn the hearts of many, and they can do so without defining who that nation is. Well, it certainly isn't my family. The lime world does a similar thing. Currently, there's much debate about the benefits of high calcium versus hydraulic limes. But rather than sticking to the facts, high calcium has become pure or true, meaning the other is impure and false, while hydraulic has accrued a natural pronoun, meaning any alternative is somehow less wholesome. Each side attempting to squeeze a little bit more morality away from the opposition. Quasi-religious rhetoric, obscuring objective reasoning, flattening out and then bending verifiable truth. I like this. This well-ordered contemporary building site presents bricklayers and their work in a professional way. The unspoken truth of knowing how to get things done efficiently has intangible heritage writ large. They're bricklayers, not heritage bricklayers or lime plasterers or building conservators. Adding such pronouns and post-nominals adds 30% to the cost and switches hard hats and boots for berets and cravats. If you can't build a house from footings to DPC, and from there to eaves and gable end and do it with alacrity, how can you be expected to understand the role of brickwork at Hampton Court? The transition in practice these lads and lasses would need to work in lime is tiny. It is my view that the transition for many working in the heritage industry to the coherence of this site would be insurmountable. And if as archaeologists we don't understand the process of construction, it presents us with a difficulty interpreting the sense of standing buildings. There is no romance in this Tudor brickwork. It's poorly planned, badly executed, and whoever built it did so knowing that the inconsistencies would be hidden. But we are choosing to value it in its unfinished form, which does a disservice to those who commissioned and undertook the work, nor is it climate resilient. My friend Peter Berman makes an interesting point. Ruskin is more read about than read, and the heritage industry just soaks up the highlights and spits them back out, waiting for the applause. In the Seven Lamps, Ruskin is forthright, in inverted commas, the true colours of architecture are those of natural stone. This doesn't actually stand up to scrutiny. Surely the true colours of architecture, whatever cultural, political, religious or environmental constraints there are at any given time, in inverted commas, but to cover brick with cement and divide this cement with joints that it may look like stone is to tell a falsehood, ignores the presentational and functional evidence that simply overwhelms us. In inverted commas, all the fair devices that were ever fancied are not worth a lie. Leave your walls as plain board or build them of baked mud and chopped straw if needs be, but do not roughcast them with a falsehood. I think this displays the most profound lack of understanding of the vernacular building process with no substantiating evidence. Ruskin's disavowal of science was inherited by Morris and Webb, and that reluctance to consider evidence systematically and impartially remains at the heart of the heritage industry. After the First World War, there was a recognition that the idea of a romantic ruin was no longer sustainable, and that many ivy-clad medieval buildings were in catastrophic decline and that intervention was crucial. Sir Charles Peers and architect Frank Bain effectively invented the Ancient Monuments Department, and their approach was very much conservative as found, and a display of the archaeological remains. And this was best achieved by highlighting the different phases of the construction and accentuating each stone. And the methodology for the conservation of ruins morphed into the language of roof buildings. But archaeology surely isn't a finish, it's a process, and minimum intervention doesn't stop decay. The science on that is really clear. Water, temperature, salt, biological growth, pollution, etc. are the causes. So, are we practicing the legibility of curated neglect under the twin banners of honesty and archaeology? The Ruskin view that stone and where value is inviolate has inhibited the heritage industry from academic or practical inquiry, a position supported by the principles of conserve as found and honest repair, which have been adopted by the international charters. In recent years, these principles have been robustly challenged. Wells 2010, Glendinning 2013, Emmerich 2014, the Bird Charter, the Nara document, but crucially, they are largely ignored by the heritage industry. The principle of conservation, I argue, have become the problem and stifled inquiry. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Multispectral imaging identifies different colours by their variable wavelengths, and the process has been used to recognise polychromatic finishes on Greek marbles, in this case the Parthenon. But we find it on Republican and Imperial Roman statuary and internal fresco. We find it on medieval work and carving from the early modern period. We've known about polychromatic finishes since the 18th century and ignored them. In their papers examining replicas and how meanings can evolve, Jones and Foster examine authenticity relative to the Cadboll stone and the St. John's Cross on Iona. What they argue is that exact replicas can take on new significances, which is actually fair enough. My issue is that they predicate their research and conclusions on a bare stone model. It's as if, somehow, early medieval work slipped off the radar and forgot how to be hyperreal, which is remarkable given other aspects of early medieval cultural life. I accept that this may seem a stretch from Harlem pointing, but what I'm suggesting is that the idea of bare stone has taken a disproportionate hold on contemporary heritage management and is firmly embedded within society at large. The late Charles McKean made an interesting point about the way Scotland is represented as backward, dirty and barely literate, and it's a continuing process. In the 2018 film Mary Queen of Scots, Holyrood Palace is presented as a cave, while the English court's civilised and dainty. So I ask myself, has the naturalistic truth of Ruskin been spun for political ends as the debate around Scotland's independence becomes pressing? The capacity of architecture to express political ideology is nothing new. In Nazi Germany in the 1930s, the process of Endstucking, or the stripping of stucco from buildings to reveal the purity of the underlying structure, was a process redolent with all the bleaker significance of racial superiority. But there's nothing new here. In 1762, Johann Winkelmann, the founder of art history, identified polychromatic work on statuary at Pompeii and Herculaneum, and neatly boxed it away, because the white marble of classical antiquity better demonstrated the apogee of human physical and cultural development, Greece being located perfectly between cold, white northern areas and the extreme heat of Africa and Asia, where skin colour was dark. Goethe takes up a similar theme, in inverted commas. It is also worthy of remark that savage nations, uneducated people and children have a great predilection for vivid colours, that animals are excited to rage by certain colours, that people of refinement avoid vivid colours. But in the interest of balance, we shouldn't assume that finishes equate to something warm and fuzzy. If we consider the impact of Hanoverian barracks dotted throughout the Highlands, linked by wade roads, then we can begin to explore convenience, not meaning something handy, but in combination with taste and politeness, fit for purpose. In this example, the Rutherford Barracks, now a romantic ruin, but formerly the 18th century equivalent of Camp Bastion, with pretty much the same dark message. My thanks to Stefan Sagrot for the Camp Bastion analogy. How the past is presented matters, and finishes play a significant role. From the outset, our research demonstrated that we knew very little about the spatial and temporal extent of lime coats in Scotland, let alone the details, so we adopted a no previous knowledge baseline. The fieldwork identified an unbroken thread of completely covering buildings, primarily with Harl from the 12th to the late 17th century, when we see the introduction of bare stone, what many of you would call ashlar. Significantly, the process of adopting a bare stone paradigm in the north or west of Scotland is much slower to evolve. That evolution takes place in several forms and made clear with the study of, at the time, 300 examples. The results have been published online as Historic Environment Scotland's Technical Papers 31 and 33. And the fieldwork continues with PhD candidate Kate North's research. Let me take you through the methodology. It began as a desk-based analysis in a number of locations. So, in this example, Edinburgh Castle, we used evidence from prints, which questions the current presentation. Similarly, early 18th century paintings suggest a different narrative for the Edinburgh Old Town, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Positions substantiated by archive photographs. The collective desktop study was then compared with the on-site evidence, which within the context of the heavily cleaned Canongate, we found only fragments. Nonetheless, you can begin to build up a compelling story by integrating different evidence sources. Late 18th century watercolour and archive images from 1913 of St Clement's Church show the church with almost complete lime cover, but it also provides us with a rare documentary source, with architect Alexander Ross proclaiming, "The writer of these notes had the pleasure of removing the plaster from the walls and repointed them." In contrast, Stuart William, writing to the Board of Ordnance in 1792, complains that recent internal painting work has been spoiled because the house was not rough cast. Interestingly, decoration in 2022 has been spoiled for the same reason, and the building remains without Harl. Go figure. The physical evidence was divided into two groups, primary and secondary. In more detail, we looked at mortar colour, binder aggregate dissolution, and friability. We looked at lime inclusions. We assessed mortars made by burning marine resources, shells for example, and included as aggregates. We also confirmed lime finishes by the presence of least gang mortar swirls. I want to now turn to site selection and the impact of unforeseen observations. So let's go back to St Clement's. A planned inspection following a desk-based analysis with compelling results. So far, so good. More compelling, however, are previously unrecorded buildings en route. So the bulk of the entries for the study aren't the planned observations, but the unforeseen. Let's not underestimate the value of drive-by archaeology. In this case, perched on a hillside, isolated and seen at a distance. By stopping and snooping, one can soon develop a more meaningful metric. The inclusion of unforeseen observations changed the study from formal, planned, localized investigation to large-scale, nationwide randomized survey. I'm trying to highlight that there's no bias in the survey. We didn't focus on specific areas with prior knowledge. I can't stress how important unforeseen observations are, but it was significant how few of the planned observations described finish in the listing, scheduling, or Canmore descriptions. The frightening thing is that the survey was easy. The question is, why has nobody looked? We looked at the full range of building types in Scotland. These are just a few. I want to take a few moments and look at places of evidence and how and where to look for them. In this example, a not particularly interesting late 19th century church hardly seems worth the effort of stopping. Yet looking that bit closer gives us a hint of what might have been an earlier interpretation. Traces of Harl and limewash on each elevation. Closer still, and tucked behind a headstone, we get a better sense of complete cover. full harl and limewash, and as we'll see, the survival of limewash is a crucial outcome of the study. Similarly, basements and roof spaces where later additions conceal earlier iterations of the building, in this case New Hales House by James Smith in 1686, with later additions by William Adam in 1720, the latter conserving the evidence of lined-out plaster which Adam then replicates. Below-ground archaeology also has a place. In this example, an early 13th century wall was made more substantial later in the century, and that development conserved the earlier external plaster. A consistent observation throughout the study was how little attention we archaeologists have given external lime coats, even when they're patently obvious. If we're to build resilience, we need to consider the relationship between presentation and functionality. Here we're presented with a formal sandstone front, contrasted with the basalt rubble gable end. The harl has been removed from the gable and repointed with the heritage joint. In doing so, ledges and troughs have been created over the whole gable. Now water can only be tabled back into the wall core through porous joints. So we've moved from conserve as found to do what the hell you like because we've ticked that materials are all that matters box. The evidence in practice today demonstrates that we are not prepared for a climate change future, and using lime doesn't equate to conservation. We can identify former complete lime finishes, not simply because there are traces, but because pointed rubble of this type is illogical. And let's just sling into the evidence mixed bonding characteristics. Here you can see the lack of regularity in the coursing and bonding, in some cases near straight joints. We have to ask ourselves, is this the polite architecture of the late Georgian period? And if we move into that concealed area under the stair, we can find finish still clean to the basalt and ryeback tail. We can also see limewash hanging onto the raised margin, even though someone's had a really good go at angle grinding it off. And if we get right under the arch, we get a sense of limewash covering mortar and margin, rendering the building seamless and therefore seamly. We considered the hierarchy of elevations, so on the front we can see regularized basalt blocks, sandstone raised margins and rusticated coins. On the sides and rear is random rubble. All the elevations have substantial traces of lime finishes, so why the difference in style? Why square the most miserable building material in Scotland? The most likely reason is that the front was plastered and lined out relative to the coinstones, while the sides and rear were harled, all elevations linked by limewash. What we looked at was a combination of resources, and this included the presentation of self through the medium of home. Are we saying that our very self-satisfied couple would be happy looking like rural clods through the medium of architecture? For me, the epistemological constraint flies out of the window when we consider the accumulated evidence of archaeology, functionality, and presentation, a triangulated approach. Staying with the secondary evidence, if we look at the arch between the nave and choir, we can see a polychromatic scheme applied to a fine line plaster, the plaster acting as a gesso, all made possible by droving on the stone surface, creating a key. We can also see that the Victorian cleaners haven't managed to pick away the remains of the gesso on each side of the nose. Recent Roman finds in Carlisle are outstanding. The interpretation of the crude tooling has been attributed to the sculpture being located out of plain sight. We can rethink this hypothesis if we consider instead two different skill sets. The first, whether local resources allow for fine masonry decarving, with colour applied directly to Roman marble, for example, and the second, where the available stone was not of high quality. In the second scenario, the virtuosity of the plasterer came to the fore, and on the right is a 3rd century BCE Etruscan example. Now we can begin to consider a very different attitude towards stone and a more nuanced skill set. Learning how and where to look is an evolving area of study, as Kate North's fieldwork is demonstrating. At Fountains Abbey, Kate is comparing the external and internal masonry styles. We can see that the two styles are the same. Given the increased exposure on the exterior, the masonry seems to be bare stone, while the interior retains plaster. But with closer scrutiny, that's a position which is increasingly difficult to substantiate. Once we understand the principles of traditional building practice and how and where to look for evidence, then we can apply the logic of backward induction. Can we then begin to reimagine not just plastered surfaces, but a polychromatic Scotland when Catholicism dominated the religious and secular world, now applied to the exterior of buildings? Let's turn to the results of the survey. The evidence for much larger aggregates than we are currently using was compelling, but early examples of lime were fragmentary. In both examples, this is likely to be an underestimation of the size and range of aggregates and the former presence of lime wash. On the left, you can see an example of lime wash I applied 30 years ago, the image taken from a west elevation but in a sheltered location. The middle image is from the same elevation but in an exposed area. You can appreciate the binder is separating from the aggregate following the loss of the lime wash. On the right is an example of Harl applied in the 1720s, and you can see the stone exposed and understand why the measurement of the Harl thickness needs to be circumspect. Moreover, when mortar sampling is undertaken, it's essential to record the sample in situ and provide detailed description of the size and range of aggregates still clinging to the wall. This becomes prescient when the mortar analyst is not the sampler. In our work at the Rutherford Barracks, Callum Graham from Historic Environment Scotland and I discovered to our cost and by accident that without higher binder content, there is the inevitable loss of the aggregate from the sample, and this has profound implications for our understanding of the evolution of finishes and for the conservation of the monument, because the bias changes the void ratio of the sand in the extant mortar. The other crucial outcome of the survey was the identification of a relationship between wall building and finishing during construction, meaning the masonry was coated as it was being built rather than wait until the structure was complete. The process has implications for the robustness of finishes by creating the perfect condition in which carbonation and the curing of hydraulic mortars can take place. That's a relative humidity of between 40 and 80% over a prolonged period. What is significant is the strength of the mortar at the joints and demonstrated by its long-term survival. But it also gives us an insight into the intangible heritage of masonry walling, a building process that was understood to be covered from the point of construction, hence William Adams' term for rubble work as rough work. Here you can see the relationship between bedding stone and finishing, where there is no separation between the two. By that I mean no drying or carbonation front. We identified several key features. Early Harl was thick and applied as a single coat. There is some evidence for thinner lined out plaster also applied as a single coat. At no point did we identify the process of Harl or plaster applied as a multi-coat system often used in conservation. Finishes folded around coinstones, chamfered and roll mouldings, and into the window and door details. By the early 18th century, Harls in lowland and central belt areas are reduced in thickness, and here you can see the raised margin. The Harl sitting below the front face of the margin, so the shadow is cast by the margin onto the Harl and not the other way around. This was achieved by an increased refinement in pinning, galleting and snecking throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Procedures that add robustness to the structure by helping resist torsion and increase compression, particularly in the perk joints, which don't have the same constant load as the horizontals. It is my view, as a tradesman, that much of the vitriol and virtual signalling about binder type is superseded by the importance of packing the bejesus out of the joint. If we look at the timeline, we can see the wider impact this had on coat thickness. The depth of finish in the early examples is due to wear. The reduction in coat thickness in the 16th and 17th centuries is relative to the refinement in Renaissance architecture when tower house building peaks. It is significant that refinement in galleting, pinning and snecking, corresponds with this general refinement in architecture. Coat thickness levels off during the 18th and 19th century and declines thereafter. Excuse me. Which corresponds with the reduction in wall width in the same period. So, for clarity, the evidence tells us that as walls diminish in thickness, there's a corresponding diminution in the thickness of coats. But there's a secondary reduction in wall width in the area below the sill in domestic architecture, and it's worth bringing together the reasons why this happens. By the 17th century, neoclassicism was firmly established in tandem with the landscape garden. The Little Ice Age made the garden less accessible in northern Britain. However, the combined technologies of crown glass and the sliding sash window meant that the garden could be experienced from the interior of the building. This is only possible if space is created within the window area to accommodate the mantle gown. Again, to be clear, the evidence tells us that as lime coats become thinner, there's also reduction in wall width and a further diminution below the window in a residential building of the long 18th century. Finally, we identified the use of limewash seems to peak in the 19th century and decline thereafter by a combination of factors, including no longer fashionable and removal. The poor representation of limewash in the early examples is likely to be removal in times of religious strife and wear bias. We cannot dismiss wear bias. But can we begin to think about the anthropology of finishes? Because the data anomaly is at odds with pictorial evidence from much of Europe, where plaster, colour wash, paint, whatever that means, and sgraffito are commonplace. It's also significant that limewash was used in strategic areas where the focus was at street level, and more specifically around doors and windows, a position substantiated by archive images. And there's a link to the fieldwork evidence. Limewash remained a process employed in rural areas even into the 20th century. The on-site archaeology showed the cyclical nature of rewashing with multiple coats applied across the wall face and into the cut details, leaving us with a sense of plaster and limewash used to manage the external and internal environments by a process sometimes called hybrid buffering. You begin to get a better understanding of the cruciality of triangulated evidence, a methodology we've not previously been very good at. However, by the late 18th century, particularly in the central belt and urban areas, the dominant expression of architecture is bare stone, and thereafter we see the arrival of rubble mania and what we now think of as pointing. We identified 16 different pointing styles, and several factors need to be considered. Firstly, the overwhelming commonality was formality achieved by lining out by pressing into the joint with a purpose-made tool while the mortar was green. Sometimes white lining was added. It might also mean dotting the joints with small shims of slate to create a black definition rather than white. What strikes me about this is the level of skill required and the time it would take at the point of construction. What was lacking within the study was any evidence for the now universal method of a recessed joint beaten with a churn brush. So there's been a consistent response to TP33 running along the lines of, well, I don't like these, I wouldn't have them on my house or church. So I want to be really clear here. I'm not asking you to admire the examples, I'm offering you them as evidence. Should our preference be dictating policy? If so, what is it we're conserving, and crucially for whom? The place we're now in has a 19th century resonance where the morality of using lime has exceeded the function. I think now is the time to ask ourselves some searching questions. My sense is that the approach to conservation is like received pronunciation. It doesn't upset anybody. Well, except for a handful of us. I want to return to the data presented earlier, where wall thickness diminishes generally and specifically under windows. The process is repeated floor on floor. Bear in mind that water is discharged from glass at a greater rate than the surrounding masonry. What we can see here is that the window now takes up about 1/3 of the total volume of the elevation. Understanding how all the different elements of a building come together is crucial. So, by putting the elevations, sections and plan together, we can understand wall morphology as a series of substantial piers, triangulated at the corners, and linked by insubstantial ties. Externally, there are stone lintels with timber supports behind them, onto which masonry is placed. This houses the floor joists. It's a relationship that's dependent on everything being dry, which is unlikely because the area is prone to cracking, and this pattern of cracking from top to bottom was near universal in residential buildings throughout the long 18th century. The consequence of that vulnerability in driving rain is inundation, timber decay, and exponential vulnerability of the structure because the timber is no longer working in tandem with the masonry. William Adam recognised this vulnerability and insisted that joist ends were tarred before insertion, and my thanks to William Kay for the reference. The isometric helps illustrate how integral timber is in tying the structure together. The timber safe lintels, the floor joist, and the floorboards act in unison. And this allows you to see all the component parts together, and you can see the cracking from ground level meandering around the windows up to the crow steps and eaves. So now let's think about the sill. This had to be placed accurately because the window margins are located on it. The margins have really fine joints, so there's very little tolerance for moving them to keep them plumb. The trend noted was to keep the masonry under the sill low and place the sill on padstones, filling the panel below retrospectively. The horizontal sill joint and the panel of rough work is never in compression because it's been slotted in from the front rather than wall from above. In addition, the wall is a single skin with a direct link to the external environment. In this example, you can see the very fine crack just below the sill. It's a crack that's developed in a wall width of no more than 200 millimeters and formed by mortar shrinkage and the stresses and strains of the structure noted earlier. For clarity, this would not conform to the British standard on solid wall masonry. Masonry of this width with this degree of exposure without a coating would fail to meet the requirements of BS 5628 in new work, so why we think traditional masonry can cope is puzzling. Which takes on greater significance when one considers that Scotland is the wettest and windiest country in Europe, with gusting wind speeds during storms Aidan and Ciara of up to 70 miles an hour. I want to now look at proof of concept and applied science. Storm conditions with lower air pressure are accompanied by wind and rain. The wind that flows around a building is described as dynamic pressure. This is a very general computational fluid dynamic illustration, the blue representing low pressure. You can see that there's a difference in pressure between the front, rear, and side of the building. But there's also a difference between the external pressure on the windward elevation and the interior, the blue again representing low pressure. Let's give a bit more clarity to that general picture. At the external wall face, the velocity of wind and its kinetic energy is curtailed abruptly, creating high pressure. We know all buildings aren't airtight and that there are cracks, often tiny, on all elevations. On the windward side, there can be air-water infiltration. If the sum of infiltrating air is less than the sum of exfiltrating air on all the other elevations and the roof combined, then there will be an external-internal pressure difference. In conditions of wind-driven rain, water enters the building envelope via three agencies: capillarity, driving rain through wide gaps, and pressure difference through tiny cracks, pressure difference being the corollary of wind. So, hypothesis. Pressure differences combined with structural deformation can be negated by complete lime coats. Built an airtight chamber and used a dust extractor to replicate the pressure variables expected in storm conditions. The testing regime used was the ASTM standard, which measures air leakage in new buildings at 75 pascals. The baseline for this experiment was 70 pascals pressure difference, and the irrigation system delivering water equal to an exceptional but not unheard of event based on Met Office figures. We also looked at real pressure differences in storm conditions. These were gusting readings recorded at a leaking building during storms Ada and Kiara. From left to right, 280, 90 and 120 pascals, so we can feel absolutely secure that the testing regime is robust. Pressure difference makes a significant impact when a wall has no surface treatment or where there are very small cracks. In this, pressure differences from 0 to 70 pascals. With no pressure difference, the rate of water entering the chamber was 125 milliliters per minute. At 70 pascals, that increased to 375. At the base of the graph are the various lime treatments, so let's expand them. We can see that all the treatments improve matters. The green trend line indicates the heritage joint. Pointing is the least effective, full rough cast and lime wash the most impactful. When we ratcheted up the pressure difference beyond the 70 pascal baseline, there was an exponential increase in inundation. In this case, we compared the difference between high calcium and hydraulic mortars. The most significant outcome here is the amount of water entering the chamber in the high calcium mortar scenario, and this can be accounted for by the amount of shrinkage within the mortar after 3 and 6 months. In contrast, once the high calcium hull had been lime washed, no water entered the chamber, hence there's no trend line. The difference between the effectiveness of the two mortar types is very small. The difference between coated and not coated is substantial. Most would regard New Lanark as a success. It's sanctioned at the highest level, though there is no substantiating evidence. But it does generate income, so income trumps authenticity, with a price tag of stone decay and ultimately loss of the asset. And therein lies the problem. We keep repeating the process, knowing it's not climate responsible, nor in this case reflective of a Scottish Enlightenment. I hear the terms building pathology and retrofit bandied about, without any recognition that what they are assessing are buildings without their skins. So the baseline from which we're predicating all our modelling is flawed. So what's the point? This is important because we continue to export the idea that somehow the built environment was a rustic idyll. Archaeologists have hidden powers and will be pivotal in this crucial period of change to provide the robust evidence needed to challenge the contemporary source of authority. Despite the many critiques of Ruskin and the attempt to place him within the context of his own time, and to be clear, I have some sympathy with that, we can take him at his word. And we can do so because we remain tied to a flawed ideology that ascribes animistic values to buildings which they don't have. They're buildings, they're not sentient beings. In this changing climate, I think we need a different approach. One that moves forward on a timeline and learns to appreciate newness value and the textures and colours of renewal that in the past have kept the trades alive. I accept that some of you will have found this talk difficult, despite the overwhelming evidence, its diversity, and sometimes its sheer simplicity. Let me return to my opening remarks, when I asked you not to simply accept the conclusions of the talk, but to consider them relative to how people have identified themselves in the past, and what this means in terms of the functionality of the building process. I hope I'll have made you pause, think, and above all look and look again. But be warned, finishes are everywhere and they are addictive, and once seen, they cannot be seen. But do you know what? Let's finish by ditching the science, binning the archaeology, trashing the methodology, and forgetting conservation philosophy, and instead ask ourselves a simple question. Which of these two surfaces is likely to be resilient in a climate change future? And if you have been listening and you've managed to follow that with all my coughing, thank you very much indeed, and do join us at the Lime Finishes group.